The gate opened with a screech she'd probably remember for the rest of her life. Metal against metal, short and dry, like someone had snapped their fingers and said, "You're free." Claire stood in the doorway another second, not quite ready to take the step. Behind her lay the concrete yard, the guard tower, a dog barking somewhere behind the building. Ahead of her was just a road, cracked asphalt, puddles skinned over with a thin crust of ice, a gray November sky hanging over Framingham. She had a bag in her hand. Light. Too light for 4 years of a life. The wind found its way under her jacket right away, and Claire shivered. The jacket wasn't hers. They'd handed it to her on the way out. Blue, a man's cut, 2 sizes too big. She zipped it up to her chin and took her first step past the fence. The bus stop was maybe 300 yards off. She walked toward it slowly, listening to the thin ice on the puddles crunch under her boots.
She didn't pass anyone on the way. No cars, no people, just a crow sitting on a pole, watching her with a kind of businesslike indifference. There was a slip of paper in her jacket pocket. Claire had pulled it out at least 10 times over the past week, even though she already knew it by heart. Group Home for Children, Worcester, Massachusetts. That was all it said. No last name, no age for the girl she hadn't seen in almost 4 years. Just an address, handed to her by a caseworker right before her release, who'd said, "Tired. Start there first. They'll be able to tell you where the child is now." She may have already been moved somewhere else. Maybe. Claire sat down on the bench at the bus stop and looked at the road. Cars passed now and then, ordinary, unremarkable cars, with people inside going about their business, with no idea that the person sitting near them had no home, no money, no job, and exactly one goal: find her daughter.
4 years ago, she'd walked through that gate a completely different person. Pregnant, certain that in a few months she'd be back home, in her own apartment, at her own company, in her own life. Back then, it had seemed like a mistake, one that would get straightened out any day. The investigation would sort it out. Her lawyer would prove it. Derek would help. Now, sitting on a cold bench with someone else's jacket on her shoulders and a bag at her feet, Claire already knew. The home she'd planned on returning to 4 years ago no longer existed. 4 years ago, everything had started very differently. The party had been at a country club in Wellesley. A partner company was celebrating its 10th anniversary and had invited Claire as the head of one of their key contractors. Her firm did auditing and financial consulting for mid-sized businesses.
In 9 years, Claire had grown it from a 2-room office into a full floor in a building in Boston's financial district, with a view out over the Charles River. She'd come alone, as usual. By 34, Claire was used to it, arriving alone, leaving alone, making her own decisions and dealing with the consequences herself. Her parents had died young. Her brother lived in another state and mostly called on holidays. She had almost no close friends left, the kind she could talk to about life instead of work. She'd given the company too much of her time. She noticed Derek at the bar. Tall, well-built, in a dark suit that fit him perfectly, he was talking with 2 older men. One of them held a glass of whiskey, the other a plate of appetizers. Derek spoke quietly, smiled now and then, and seemed completely at ease in that company. About 20 minutes later, he came over to her. "You're with Donahue Advisory, aren't you?" he asked, holding out his hand. "Derek, I've heard about you." "Heard what exactly?" Claire shook his hand, narrowing her eyes slightly. "That you're the only person in this city who can find a hole in a company's books in an hour that 3 staff accountants missed for months." She smiled. "That's an exaggeration." "I don't think so." The conversation came easily after that. Derek talked about his own business, something to do with real estate investment and logistics. He mentioned a few properties out of the city, talked about shipments, new projects. No showing off, no attempt to make it clear how much money he had. He was a good listener. He didn't interrupt, and he asked the right questions. When Claire talked about her company, he seemed genuinely interested. asked how she'd started it, how many people she had on staff now, which clients gave her the most trouble. Claire was surprised at how quickly she relaxed around him. By the end of the night, he didn't ask for her number. He just took a business card out of his inside pocket and handed it to her. If you're ever looking for an outside opinion on an investment, get in touch. No strings attached. Sure. It was good meeting you. You too. He went off to talk to other guests, and Claire stood there a while longer, holding the card. Heavy stock, simple font, just a name, a title, a phone number. None of the long lists of titles and company names some people like to put on those things. Claire decided, at the time, that it was a good sign. She'd always liked people who didn't need to talk about themselves for very long. She put the card in her purse and forgot about it almost immediately. It was only a few days later, going through her things after the party, that she saw it again. She didn't know yet that Derek had had those cards printed specifically for that evening. 50 of them, total. The order was pulled the very next day. The next 6 months went by calmly, easily. Later, Claire would replay them in her mind again and again, trying to pin down the exact moment things had started going wrong. Derek never rushed her. He didn't call every day. He'd take her to dinner about once a week, and always insisted on paying. No show about it. The waiter would bring the check. Derek would put down his card and go right back to the conversation. He could talk about money calmly, without trying to impress her. He described his projects only in general terms: a warehouse outside Worcester, a logistics hub, negotiations with a big retail chain. Sometimes he'd show her photos from a job site on his phone, tell her about contractors who'd blown deadlines, or partners who'd forced him to redo contracts. None of it seemed out of the ordinary. Real business is rarely smooth. There's always someone holding up a shipment, missing a deadline, demanding new paperwork, or promising one thing and doing another. The first strange moment came in March.
They were at a restaurant in Cambridge. Derek's phone rang, and he stepped away from the table. He came back a minute later, sat down across from her, but somehow the sound on his phone was still on. Claire only caught the end of the call. "I already told you, not now. Let Rebecca decide for herself. I'm not getting involved in that." He noticed her looking, put the phone back in his pocket, and smiled, unbothered. "A partner. Logistics problems. Don't worry about it." "Who's Rebecca?" Derek hesitated for a second. "A bookkeeper for one of the contractors. It's their own mess to sort out." Claire nodded and didn't ask anything else. Who knew who worked for him? New people, firms, contractors were always coming up in his projects. She remembered the name, but within a few days, she'd all but stopped thinking about it. That summer, Derek introduced her to a partner on one of his projects, a man in his 50s named Gary Phelps. Gary didn't talk much, but he listened closely. Over dinner, he asked Claire a few questions about her work, and when Derek stepped away to take a call, he suddenly said, "You're a pleasure to deal with, not like the last one." Claire looked at him. "I'm sorry?" Gary seemed to realize himself that he'd said too much. "Nothing. Work stuff." Derek came back to the table, and Gary immediately steered the conversation toward some property out of town. Claire never saw him again after that night. She could have pressed Derek with a dozen more questions right then, but things were going well between them. Derek was attentive, remembered small things she forgot herself. He'd show up in the evening with dinner if she was working late, or set a cup of coffee down beside her without a word when he saw she'd been buried in reports for 3 hours straight. Against all of that, the occasional odd comment lost its weight fast. By fall, Claire realized she was pregnant. She told him over dinner at the same restaurant in Cambridge where she'd first heard Rebecca's name 6 months before. Derek was quiet for maybe 10 seconds. In that time, Claire had already run through his possible reactions in her head more than once, and even caught herself worrying that his happiness would turn out to be an act. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I want us to move in together. Right away, not later." Claire smiled. "I was just trying to figure out how to tell you that myself." "So we were thinking the same thing." He squeezed her fingers, and Claire suddenly felt some tension ease out of her. Tension she hadn't even noticed was there. Glasses clinked at the next table, and the smell of seared meat and spices drifted out from the kitchen. A waiter passed by, balancing a tray on one hand. 2 weeks later, they started on paperwork for an apartment. A big one in a new condo building in the seaport.
Derek wanted to put it in both their names. He'd show Claire the floor plan on his phone, ask what color to paint the nursery, where to put the crib. Claire would listen to him and sometimes catch herself smiling. She'd gotten used, a long time ago, to relying only on herself. Now there was someone else thinking about what their life would look like a year from now, 5 years from now. She wanted that. It was right around then that Derek asked her to sign something. They were sitting in her kitchen. 2 cups of cold coffee stood on the table, next to a folder full of papers. "Just a formality," Derek said, spreading out the documents. "A partnership agreement for the logistics project. I told you about it. It just needs your signature as guarantor on a corporate account. The deal's time-sensitive. The bank's window closes Friday." Claire reached for the folder. "Let me actually read it." "Sure, there just really isn't much time. Gary's already called twice."
She opened to the first page. 10 pages of dense legal language. The terms were familiar, the wording standard. Claire skimmed the main points quickly, lingering on the guarantee amount. It all seemed reasonable enough. Outside, it was already getting dark. The kitchen was reflected in the window glass, and dinner was going cold on the stove. She'd just gotten home from work, her head still buzzing from a full day of meetings and reports. She flipped through a few more pages. "Is that everything?" "Yeah, standard partnership agreement." Claire glanced once more at the numbers in the appendix, signed it, and handed the documents back to Derek. A few days later, he brought a notary to her office. It was near the end of the workday, employees trickling out one by one. The hallway smelled like coffee and printer paper. Claire signed 2 more times. After that, she didn't give the document another thought. About a month later, she happened to notice a transfer on the company statement that she hadn't authorized. $18,500. The payment description read, "Consulting Services, Meridian Project." Claire stared at the screen for a few seconds, then pulled up the bank statement again. She definitely hadn't authorized that transfer. Claire called the bookkeeper. "That's from the documents you signed last month, Mrs. Donahue," the woman answered, flustered. "Everything's in order." "Which documents exactly?" There was a short pause on the line. "The Meridian Project Agreement. It's all in the folder." Claire closed her eyes and pinched the bridge of her nose. Something tightened uncomfortably inside her. Not panic yet, more like an unease she couldn't quite explain to herself. She pulled out the folder of documents and set it in front of her. That night, Claire read through the agreement carefully for the first time, start to finish. She decided to look into it herself, quietly. She pulled the folder of signed documents and asked the company's corporate attorney to put together a summary of every transaction on the project over the past 2 months. When the table landed on her desk, Claire spent a few minutes just staring at the screen. The amounts were small, scattered across dozens of payments. One transfer, then another, then another, then a few more after that. She pulled up the list of counterparties. Many of the companies had been registered only recently. Several shared the same registered address, a small office building on the outskirts of Worcester. A few of the accounts had been opened at the same bank. Too many coincidences. Claire picked up the phone and called Derek. "I need to talk to you about the Meridian Project," she said. "There are some strange entries." "Strange how?" he asked. His voice was even, but he was talking a little faster than usual. "Transfers to companies I've never heard of, and I didn't sign off on them." "I signed for a completely different amount." Silence on the other end. "Look," he said finally, "it really is a complicated setup. I didn't explain all of it because I didn't want to bury you in details. Let's meet up. I'll show you everything." They met the next day. Derek showed up with a folder of printouts and looked completely calm. He spread the documents out on the table, opened to a few pages. "Here's the intermediate accounting," he explained. "The money passes through one company first, then goes out to the supplier. This is equipment, this is transport. It all reconciles at the end of the month." "And these companies?" "Technical subcontractors. They're needed for the accounting." "Why do 3 of them share the same address?" Derek didn't even pause. "It's an office building. A lot of companies are registered there. That's standard practice these days." He spoke with confidence, no hesitation. He explained about equipment suppliers, intermediate accounts, the quirks of the accounting. Claire listened and asked a few questions along the way. At first glance, it all sounded convincing, but the numbers still didn't add up. She went back to the table she'd looked at that morning and mentally walked through the transactions again. One amount appeared twice in different places. One of the payments had no clear justification at all. Claire looked up at Derek. He smiled and gathered the papers. "You've just gotten too used to looking for problems that aren't there." Claire didn't answer. She put the documents back in the folder. "I'm going to look into it again." "Sure." She never got the chance to finish. 3 days later, her office was raided in the morning. There were 6 of them, Boston police detectives and 2 investigators from the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. With a search warrant, they read out fast and flat. Employees stood in the hallway, some of them crying, some of them recording it on their phones, until those got confiscated too. Claire tried to make sense of what the investigator was telling her. Charges for running a money laundering scheme through a network of shell companies. Damages over $4 million. Evidence including documents bearing her signature. Payments authorized under her electronic signature. Correspondence from her work computer. "This is a mistake," she kept saying. "I didn't sign this. I mean, I signed something, but not what you're describing. That was a different amount." No one listened to her the way she needed them to. She called Derek from the car on the way to her interrogation. No answer. She called again an hour later. The number was unreachable. By evening, the phone was disconnected entirely, and the apartment in the seaport they'd been about to rent together turned out to be empty. The leasing agent told her the lease had been canceled a week earlier. Later, the investigation would establish that Derek Pierce, full name Derek James Pierce, didn't exist at any of the addresses he'd given. The companies he'd described belonged to a chain of nominee owners, and a woman named Rebecca Stiles, who'd worked as a bookkeeper for one of the shell companies, had vanished from the state the same day he did. But all of that, Claire would only learn later. That evening, she sat in an interrogation room, pregnant, alone. Someone walked past in the hallway on the other side of the wall. A door slammed. The ventilation hummed to life. She stared at the table in front of her and couldn't get used to the idea that almost none of it was up to her anymore. That morning, she'd been running a company of 20 people, making decisions, signing documents, answering for other people's paychecks and contracts. Now, she had to fight just to be listened to. The trial lasted 4 months.
The public defender assigned to her once her money for a private attorney ran out could only spread his hands. The evidence looked ironclad. Her signature, her email, transfers tied to her accounts. No one could locate any witness who could confirm Derek, Gary, or Rebecca even existed. Not one of them had ever been officially registered with any of the companies named in the case as first-tier counterparties. Claire sat in the courtroom, inside the Suffolk County Superior Court, and listened to the prosecutor read out amounts, dates, account numbers, and with every session she felt the world around her grow a little more foreign, as if she were watching her own life through frosted glass. The verdict came down in February. 5 years in a state women's prison. She stayed silent while they led her out of the courtroom, silent in the car. It was only that evening, in a holding cell, with her hand resting on her stomach, that she cried for the first time in months. Not over the sentence, but over one plain animal thought. She would have to give birth in prison. Labor came early, in May. Claire was taken under guard to a hospital in Framingham. A small unit with faded walls and a smell of bleach she'd remember for the rest of her life. A guard waiting right outside the door of her room. An older midwife delivered the baby, a woman of few words with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much within those walls to be surprised by anything anymore. The girl was born strong and cried loudly, and Claire, drained, held her for only a few minutes, exactly as long as the protocol allowed. "What are you naming her?" the midwife asked, filling out paperwork. "Chloe," Claire whispered. They moved her out of the unit that same day.
They took the baby 2 days later, once the minimum medical period for staying together had passed. No one told Claire exactly where her daughter had been taken, only that the girl had been placed in the custody of the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, DCF, and put with an emergency foster family, and that what happened to her from there would be up to the agency, since the mother had no relatives willing to take temporary custody. She was left alone in the room. Outside, a light May rain was falling. Drops crawled slowly down the window glass. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed, footsteps sounded, and then it went quiet again. The only person who visited her in those first few weeks was Frank Sullivan, an older security guard who'd worked her office building for years. They'd never been close. They said good morning to each other, traded a few words now and then, about the weather, traffic, snow in winter. He knew her by sight, she knew him.
But when they let him into the visiting room, he sat down across from her, set a bag of home-cooked food on the table, and simply said, "I found out where you were, figured I'd come by." He nodded at the bag. "Brought a little something from home. Nothing fancy, but it's home cooking, at least." Claire looked at him. "Thank you. You're probably curious about what's going on at the office," Frank went on. "Though honestly, there's not much left worth telling." He spoke calmly, without pity, without prying. Claire looked at him, his plain face, the gray stubble, the old jacket he'd worn to get there, and for the first time felt like there was someone nearby who saw her not as a defendant, not as a case number, but simply as a person who needed some support. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Frank shrugged. "Why wouldn't I come? We know each other, don't we?" Claire looked down. Those few words meant a lot more to her, right then, than he could have guessed. He kept coming after that, for all 4 years she spent locked up. Prison greeted her with a barrack-style unit of 30 bunks, the smell of bleach and laundry detergent, and rules she needed to learn within the first week if she didn't want trouble. She worked in the sewing shop, stitching hospital bed sheets, quota per shift, fines for defects. Her hands quickly got used to the machine, the smell of machine oil, the steady clatter of the needle. Claire, who used to sign contracts worth tens of millions, now counted pillowcases finished per shift and felt relief when she hit quota without a write-up. She was careful about getting close to the other women in her unit. In the first few weeks, Claire learned fast. The less you said about yourself, the easier your life was in here. One of her bunkmates, Donna, already 7 years into a sentence for armed robbery, told her early on, "Don't stress too much about it. In here you either lose your mind or you get used to it. There's no third option." Claire got used to it. The days blurred into each other. Wake up, roll call, work, lunch, more work. In the evening, shower, dinner, talk in the barracks, sleep. At night, lying on her bunk, she'd run through plans in her head. Not daydreams, actual plans, one step at a time. What she'd do her first week out, where she'd go, what she'd say. She needed something to occupy her mind, or her thoughts would slide toward the place she tried not to let them go too often, toward the small bundle she'd held for only a few minutes back in May. Frank came to visit every 2 or 3 months. More wasn't allowed, and it wasn't an easy trip out to Framingham for a man living out in the western suburbs. He never showed up empty-handed. He'd bring homemade pickles, knit socks a neighbor had made for him, sometimes just a box of good tea, and every time he'd share whatever news there was, trying to keep his voice level no matter what he was telling her.
"They sold your office," he told her once, pouring tea from a thermos into plastic cups. Back in the first year after the trial. New owners opened up some kind of firm there, changed the sign out front. "And the apartment?" Claire asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "That too. Something to do with debt paperwork, according to the documents. I didn't follow all of it, honestly. A lawyer told me there wasn't much point contesting it while you're—" He hesitated. "While you're in here." Claire nodded. She'd long since stopped being surprised by news like that. The company, the car, the accounts, everything she'd spent 9 years building had disappeared just as fast as Derek had. "And about—" She couldn't finish the question. Frank was quiet for a moment. "I asked about your girl. The agency says she's alive, healthy, was with a foster family in Framingham. Looks like she's since been moved to another one, but they wouldn't say where exactly."
They won't give out information without an official request from the mother. "Can't I file an official request from in here?" Claire asked. "I tried to find out. They say you can, but it won't do much good. DCF's going to make the call after you're out anyway, once you've got a place to live and a job." Claire tightened her grip on the cup. The plastic gave a quiet crackle under her fingers. 4 years, Frank. She won't know me." "She will," he said firmly, though his eyes gave away that he wasn't sure himself. "How do you know?" He shrugged. "I don't. Just—" He paused, choosing his words. "Kids feel things. Maybe not right away, but eventually. The main thing is you don't give up on yourself." Claire lowered her eyes to the tea. She understood that Frank had no idea how things would turn out, but he still wanted to give her something to hold on to, and at the time, that was enough. A year and a half in, Claire filed her first official request with DCF, with help from an attorney working with a legal aid service for incarcerated people, who agreed to take the case for free once he saw how serious it was. The answer came back 2 months later, dry and bureaucratic. The child, Chloe, was in state custody in satisfactory health, and her future would be determined in accordance with the law once the mother was released and her parental rights and social standing had been restored. No photo, no address, just that phrase, satisfactory health, which Claire read over and over, trying to squeeze some meaning out of it. She started writing letters, not to DCF, just in the notebook they gave her for work notes. She wrote down everything she wanted to tell Chloe someday. What she'd been like at birth, how Claire had chosen her name, why she'd settled on that one. She wrote about the day she found out she was pregnant, about what she'd felt then, about how she pictured their first meeting. She didn't know if Chloe would ever see any of it, but she kept writing anyway. It made things easier. In her 3rd year, there was a conversation Claire would remember for a long time. The unit supervisor, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, called her into the office and said, without any preamble, "You've got a good record, Donahue. No write-ups, no disciplinary issues. You could file for parole in about a year." "In a year, I'll have served 4, Claire said. "Exactly. With good behavior, and given that you have a minor child outside anyone's care, the parole board tends to look favorably on that." Claire was quiet for a few seconds. Over 3 years, she'd gotten used to living in short stretches, 1 month to the next, 1 shift to the next. So the word parole sounded distant at first, almost abstract. "What do I need to do?" The supervisor explained. From that day on, Claire started preparing. She gathered documents, asked her shift supervisor for a reference, made sure she didn't pick up a single violation. At night, on her bunk, she wrote out on a separate sheet of paper what she'd do once she got out, where she'd live, how she'd look for work, where to start on getting her paperwork back in order. The parole hearing happened a year later, just as the unit supervisor had said. Claire sat in front of 5 people at a table and answered their questions. She told them she had someone willing to provide temporary housing. Frank had written a letter confirming it ahead of time. She planned to start job hunting the moment she was out. "And how do you plan to rebuild your relationship with your child?" one of the board members asked. Claire was quiet for a second. "I don't know exactly how it's going to happen.
I only know I'll do everything I can to make it happen as soon as possible. Dear friends, let's take a short pause here.
If this story has touched your heart, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps these stories find new listeners. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? At home doing chores, on the road, or maybe winding down before bed? I always love reading your answers. Thank you for being here. Now, let's continue. The board member made a note in the file and asked the next question. Claire answered. A few minutes later, it was over. 2 weeks later, the decision came. Parole granted. Claire read that line over several times. Then she folded the paper and sat on the edge of her bunk for a long time, just holding it. In a year, she'd walk out of here. And after that, she'd have to start everything over. The day the story opened with, the gate, the screech, the cold wind, arrived in early November. Claire walked out through the gate, made her way to the bus stop, and sat down on the cold bench. Her bag sat at her feet. She took the slip of paper with the group home's address out of her pocket and looked at it again. A few minutes later, a familiar old Jeep appeared on the road. Frank pulled up at the stop and got out of the car. Claire stood to meet him. "You actually came," she said. "What, you thought I'd make you walk home?" She smiled for the first time all morning. Frank picked up her bag. "Come on, stove's already going, soup's on. You'll freeze standing here." The old Jeep Cherokee had a worn body and rust spots near the back fender. Frank had meant to fix it up for years, but never got around to it until the previous summer. He'd rebuilt the starter himself, replaced the battery, done some work on the body. The car still looked rough, but now it started on the first try. Inside, it smelled like old leather, gasoline, and the heater. Warm air poured out of the vents, and at first Claire just held her hands up to it. Frank pulled out onto the highway. For the first few minutes, neither of them said anything. Claire looked out the window, at the houses going by, the store signs, the people at bus stops, and felt something strange, almost unsettling. The world had changed in these 4 years, quietly, but for real, while she'd stayed exactly where she was. "Are we going to the group home today?" she asked, as the car turned onto the highway. "We will," Frank said. "Eat something first, though." "I'm not hungry." "Uh-huh. Sure you're not." He glanced over at her. "You were in there 4 years. Soup first, at least." Claire wanted to argue, but changed her mind. "Fine." Frank nodded and turned up the heater. Outside, a light snow had started falling. It melted the moment it hit the windshield, leaving short, wet streaks. Claire rested her hand on her bag and looked at the road. She wasn't far now from seeing her daughter again. Frank's house stood on the edge of Sterling, half an hour outside the city. Old, wooden, with a leaning fence and a chimney sending up a thin trail of smoke. Inside, it smelled like firewood, old wood, and something cooking. Onions, potatoes. The floors creaked with every step. The wallpaper was peeling in places, but the house was warm, genuinely warm. Dry heat rolled off the wood stove, and after the cold ride, Claire immediately felt her hands starting to thaw. "Your room's right there," Frank said, nodding toward a door at the end of the hall. "Used to keep things in it, but I moved all that up to the attic. Bed's not new, but it doesn't creak much." "Where will you sleep?" Claire asked. "Got a couch in the kitchen. Old, but comfortable. Don't worry about it." She wanted to protest, to say she couldn't take the only decent room in an older man's house, but something in his voice left no room for arguing. That evening they sat in the kitchen, eating a simple, hearty potato and carrot soup, and Frank talked about the neighbors, about the roof that had been leaking since last fall, about how the firewood would just barely last the winter if they were careful. "Tomorrow we'll head to DCF," he said, clearing the plates. "Get together whatever paperwork they need. We'll figure something out for work, too. I know some people. I'll ask around." Claire nodded. After the long day of travel, her body was finally starting to let go. She wanted nothing more than to lie down and close her eyes. But along with the exhaustion came a strange sense of calm. Small and fragile still, but there.
That night, she lay awake a long time, listening to the floorboards creak in the unfamiliar house and the wood crackling in the stove. Outside, wet snow was falling. Claire lay under the heavy blanket, listening to the rain mixed with snow tapping on the roof.
She caught herself thinking something simple. That sound now reached her without bars, without concrete walls between her and it. DCF took them in the next day. A tired caseworker at a desk buried in folders listened to Claire's story without much sympathy, but without hostility either, just as one more case in a long list. "The girl's currently in a group home in Worcester," she said, flipping through documents. "Transferred there a year and a half ago. To restore your parental rights and get your daughter back, you'll need to provide proof of stable housing, proof of income, a clean bill of health, and a letter of reference from an employer." "I don't have steady work yet," Claire said. "I'm still looking." "Then it's too early to talk about specific timelines." The woman looked at her carefully, not unkindly, but firm. "And I should warn you, the girl's been in the system almost 4 years now. After a certain point, the agency has the right to petition the court to terminate parental rights and begin preparing her for permanent adoption if the biological parents aren't showing active effort to rebuild the relationship with the child. You have time, but not an unlimited amount of it." Claire felt something clench in her chest. "How much time exactly?" "I can't say for sure, but I'd advise you not to drag your feet on the paperwork." She walked out of the DCF building, and her knees nearly gave out. It was cold outside, a gray sky hanging low over the city. Claire stopped on the front steps, took a deep breath, and looked at the road. The clock was already running, and she had no job, no money, no place of her own. Only the house of an older man who'd taken her in and was now helping her however he could, and a daughter she hadn't seen in almost 4 years. She started looking for work that same day. First she went to a wholesale warehouse. Word was they always needed extra hands, and no one there cared much about checking paperwork. They hired her on the spot, no questions asked, hauling bundles of bedding off trucks into the warehouse, unloading boxes, sometimes covering the counter if the clerk stepped away. The work was hard on her body, but simple. By the end of the first week, her hands were covered in blisters. Her back ached so badly she could barely climb the bus steps. The pay was small, cash, off the books, just enough to cover food and bus fare. Standing out in the cold one day, unloading another batch of bundles, she suddenly thought of her old office on the 15th floor. Her secretary bringing in documents for her signature, employees waiting hours for her decision on something. Now she stood in a warehouse in gloves with holes in them, counting bundles so she wouldn't come up short with the owner. She understood that feeling sorry for herself wouldn't change anything. It would only drain what strength she had left. So she pushed the thought away, grabbed the next bundle, and carried it inside. A week later, something better came along. An acquaintance of one of the warehouse workers mentioned that a diner nearby was looking for a dishwasher. It paid a little more, and more importantly, there was a roof over her head on cold days instead of an open loading dock. Claire took it without a second thought. The diner was called The Anchor, though the nearest water was 25 miles off. A small place on Route 20 with a beat-up sign and a steady stream of truckers and passers-by. The kitchen greeted Claire with the smell of grease, boiling water, and bleach. By the second day, the smell had worked its way into her clothes and hair so thoroughly she stopped noticing it. The work was simple and repetitive. Plates, pots, sheet pans, more plates. The hot water kept cutting to ice cold. The boiler in that place only worked half the time. And by the end of a shift, her hands turned red as if scalded, the skin on her knuckles cracked and stinging. She washed dishes 10 hours straight, sometimes without a real break, and in the short minutes of rest she got, sitting on an overturned crate by the back door, she'd look at her hands. The same hands that not long ago had flipped through financial reports, signed contracts, and punched numbers into a calculator fast enough to impress even seasoned accountants. The owner, a man in his 50s named Russ Donahue, barely paid her any attention at first, hired her, gave her a quick rundown, and that was it. But by the second week, Claire started noticing.
He lingered nearby longer than he needed to, found reasons to come into the kitchen exactly when she was washing dishes alone, made comments about her looks, offhand, but persistent enough to leave no doubt about his intentions.
"You're not from around here, are you?" he said one day, leaning against the doorframe. "Come from far off?" "Not far," Claire said shortly, not looking up from the sink. "Not thinking about getting married? Woman like you shouldn't be on her own." She stayed quiet, hoping silence would be answer enough, but Russ didn't leave. He kept standing in the doorway, looking at her in a way that sent a chill down her spine. It came to a head a month later, late one evening, when the kitchen had emptied out except for the two of them. The cook had left early. The waitresses were closing up the front. Russ came in, latched the door, and got straight to the point. "Look, I pay you well. I can pay you more. Help you with an apartment even. But you've got to meet me halfway. We spend some time together, nice and easy." Claire felt everything inside her clench, but forced her voice to stay level. "I'm not interested, Mr. Donnelly. I'm going home." She tried to walk past him, but he grabbed her arm, hard, blocking her way. "Where are you gonna go? Nobody's hiring you with a record. I checked. I'm hiring you, and paying well. Think about it." She wrenched her arm free, grabbed her jacket off the hook by the door, and shoved past him, out the back door into the dark of the parking lot. She ran all the way to the bus stop without looking back, feeling her heart pound and the cold November air burn in her lungs. She got home on the last bus, soaked from the rain and sweaty from running, and once inside, sat down at the kitchen table without a word, still in her jacket. Frank took one look at her face and didn't ask anything. He just put the kettle on, pulled a half-empty bottle of some homemade liqueur out of the cabinet, poured a little into a glass, and slid it over to her. "Drink that. Tell me after if you want. And if you don't want to, that's fine too."
Claire drank it, felt the warmth spread through her chest, and finally cried. For the first time since she'd gotten out, quietly, her face in her hands. Frank didn't say anything. He just sat next to her, feeding wood into the stove. When she'd calmed down some, he said, "Tomorrow we'll find you something else. I know a guy. His neighbor runs a diner out on the highway. Think they're looking for a waitress. I'll call in the morning." The next day, over breakfast, Claire told Frank the details. Not all of it, but enough for him to understand what she'd gone through at the last job. He listened without a word, stirring sugar into his mug, and when she finished, he said simply, "People come in all kinds. Don't go thinking they're all like that." "I don't," Claire said. "I'm just tired." "Tired's normal. Means you're still alive in there." He got up, went to the old cabinet, and pulled out a worn but warm jacket, clearly his own. It hung baggy on Claire, but it kept her warm. "Take it," he said. "Yours is way too thin, and winter's just getting started." Claire wanted to refuse, but one look at his face told her arguing was pointless. She took the jacket and thanked him. All day, she caught herself thinking how unfamiliar it felt to have someone simply looking out for her. Frank didn't expect anything from her and didn't ask for anything. He just saw she was struggling and helped. That evening, Frank did call his friend. The conversation didn't take long. When he hung up, he turned to Claire looking pleased. "Go to the Crossroads tomorrow. It's a diner out on Route 9, about 20 minutes from here by bus. Tell them Sullivan sent you. They'll take you on as a waitress." The Crossroads turned out to be a modest place, with worn vinyl tablecloths, an old TV in the corner, and a permanent smell of fried potatoes that seemed to have soaked into the walls for good. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Peggy Walsh, took Claire on without much fuss. Just asked if she had restaurant experience, and hearing a vague answer, shrugged. "You'll learn. It's not complicated. Take the order, bring it out, run the check. Main thing is, don't get smart with the customers, even if they get smart with you first. Mostly truckers in here, tired folks, sometimes rude, but they tip." The first shift was rough. Claire could handle the physical side fine, but talking to people after everything she'd been through felt unfamiliar. She had to relearn how to smile at customers, answer questions calmly,
take criticism without hearing every sharp tone as a threat. But by the end of the week, she'd found her footing. She had the menu memorized, could carry a tray level, and had gotten used to the constant drone of the TV and the chatter from nearby tables. In the evenings, riding the bus home, she'd look out at the dark window and think that life was starting to level out. Slowly, painfully, but starting to. She had a small but steady paycheck. She had somewhere to live. And somewhere underneath it all was a quiet hope that sooner or later she'd have the documents DCF needed. Shifts at the diner kept coming, one after another. Mornings, afternoons, sometimes evenings when Peggy asked her to cover for one of the other girls. Claire never said no. Every extra shift meant a little more money, and she needed money now. First and foremost for the paperwork. Proof of income for DCF above all. She started putting a little aside in an old tin can she kept under the bed in her room. Every payday, she'd count the bills and write the total down in a small notebook. The number grew slowly, but it grew. Sometimes in the evening, she'd pull the can out, count the money again, and slide it back under the bed. It wasn't much, but at least now she could see it moving. After what happened with Russ, she grew more careful around men in general. If someone's eyes lingered on her a beat too long, Claire tensed up right away. She already knew how fast an ordinary conversation could cross a line. One day on her way to work, she stopped in a small shop in front of a case of cheap jewelry. Among the chains and earrings sat a few plain rings. She looked them over for a while, then picked the plainest one, thin, no stone, no design. What size? That one, please. She put the ring on right there at the counter. It looked convincing enough. At work that day, one of the regulars tried striking up a conversation again, first about the weather, then about why such a pretty woman was working at a roadside diner. Claire set the plate down in front of him, turning her hand deliberately so the ring showed. The man noticed it. Married? Yes. She said it without a smile and moved straight on to another table. No more questions after that. From that day on, she almost never took the ring off. She knew it wouldn't guarantee protection from everything, but if it kept even a few people from pushing into her personal life, then it had been worth the money. Little by little, Claire started noticing other changes in herself too. Her hands still ached after shifts, her back still throbbed by evening, but the work was getting easier. She was standing straighter again, speaking more clearly, catching small details quickly. One day she caught herself making change for a customer automatically, before the register even printed the receipt. Peggy noticed it. "You're pretty comfortable with numbers," she said one day, watching Claire quickly reconcile the checks at the end of a shift. "Used to be a bookkeeper or something?" "Something like that," Claire said, evasive.
She never told the diner's owner the full truth. Not about the record, not about the company, not about her daughter. All Peggy knew was that Claire had come recommended by Sullivan, did her job well, and didn't cause trouble. Claire preferred it that way. She just needed to work quietly, save money, and get her paperwork together. She'd tell the rest later, if it ever came up at all. At the end of November, a letter came from DCF, short, official. "You are hereby notified that the minor Chloe Donahue has been transferred from the group home in Worcester to a group home in Lowell due to a reorganization of the agency's contracted provider. Further custody proceedings may resume upon submission of the complete document package per the prior notice." Claire read the letter again. A group home in Lowell. Chloe had a new address now, a new building, new people around her.
And Claire herself was still standing in the same place, working at the diner, putting money aside, gathering documents one at a time. That evening, she showed Frank the letter. "So we need to go to the new place, find out how she's doing," he said, looking the paper over. "Maybe they'll even let us see a photo." And if, Claire stopped, unwilling to say out loud the fear that had been gnawing at her for weeks. She stared at the letter a moment longer, then made herself ask, "What if she gets adopted before I get everything together?" Frank was quiet, set the letter down on the table, and looked at her straight on. "Then we'll move faster. "You've still got time, Claire. Don't borrow trouble before it's due." She nodded, but the worry didn't go anywhere. That night she dreamed of a long hallway. Claire was running down it, trying to reach the door at the end, but it kept getting farther away with every step. By morning, the dream had mostly faded. All that was left was an unpleasant feeling, like she'd been too late for something again. The next day, Claire went in for her usual shift at the diner. She had no idea that today, of all days, her life was about to turn again. It was an ordinary day, overcast, with the occasional snowflake that melted before it hit the ground. The diner was nearly empty, just 2 truckers at a far table and a lone man by the window who came in around noon. Claire noticed him right away, not because he stood out physically, though he did look different from the usual crowd at the crossroads. A coat that clearly hadn't come from a clearance rack, confident posture, the serious, focused face of someone used to solving problems rather than waiting for other people to solve them. He ordered coffee without really looking at the menu, and the moment Claire stepped away from the table, he opened his laptop.
She came back a few minutes later with his order and, setting the cup down, heard him mutter a curse under his breath at the screen. "What is going on with this? How—" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated, and glared at a spreadsheet like the numbers had personally insulted him. "Can I help with something?" Claire asked, half out of politeness, half out of plain curiosity. The man looked up at her. He held her gaze a beat too long, as if only now really seeing her. "Well, if you're an accountant or an auditor, then maybe," he said with a small smile. "I've got a number here that just won't reconcile." He shook his head immediately. "Actually, never mind, sorry. I don't imagine you'd find this interesting. I've been stuck on it for 3 days myself." "What is it?" "Numbers for one of my projects. I can't figure out where the discrepancy's coming from." Claire glanced at the screen. "Can I take a look?" He raised his eyebrows, surprised. "You know this stuff?" "I used to."
The man studied her for another second, then turned the laptop toward her. "All right, go ahead." Claire perched on the edge of the neighboring chair, careful not to draw Peggy's attention, and looked at the screen. The spreadsheet was large, dozens of columns, but her trained eye caught the oddity within a minute. In one section, expenses shifted forward a period every month with suspicious regularity, as if someone had deliberately been pushing part of the costs forward to smooth out the current month's numbers. "Can I see the formula in this cell?" she asked, pointing. The man, clearly surprised the conversation had gotten this far, clicked the cell. The formula unrolled in a long string. Claire read it once, then again, and felt something click inside her. Recognition, a rush of old excitement, the long-forgotten feeling of spotting a hole in someone else's numbers before anyone else did. "Right here," she said, pointing to the middle of the formula. "Your carryover coefficient is wrong. Look, the system's automatically shifting part of this month's expenses to the next period, because it says plus 30 here, when it should say minus 30. That's why part of the costs just disappears from the current report every month and shows up in the next one." The man went quiet, staring at the screen, then quickly flipped through a few more sheets, checking the numbers. "Are you serious right now?" he asked, not looking away from the monitor. "Yes." He looked up at her, no trace of skepticism left, just something closer to bewilderment. "Who are you?" Claire hesitated for a second, then smiled, genuinely, for the first time in a long while, without any tension behind it. "Right now, a waitress." He introduced himself as Ethan, just the first name, no last name, no explanation of what he did for a living. Claire didn't press either. She went back to her tables, and he stayed at his for close to another hour, glancing over at her now and then while he worked through the errors she'd found. Before he left, he came up to the counter where Claire was wiping down glasses. "Thank you for the help," he said. "I mean it seriously. You probably just saved me weeks of digging." "Don't mention it," she said, trying to sound casual. "Can I ask why you're working here? With knowledge like that, it's a little strange." Claire went still for a moment, weighing what to say. She didn't want to lie, but she also had no intention of telling a stranger the whole truth. "Life happened," she said finally. Ethan nodded, didn't push, whether out of tact or because he sensed there was a story behind those few words that wasn't his to ask about uninvited. "Sometimes I need a fresh set of eyes on paperwork. If you're ever interested in some remote work on the side, give me a call," Ethan said. He set a card down on the counter. Plain, no extra flourishes, just a name and a phone number. Claire took it, trying not to let on that her hands were shaking slightly. She didn't tell him then that another man had once left her a similarly plain business card, or how that had ended. She didn't call for 3 days. Every evening she'd take the card out of her jacket pocket, set it on the table, and put it away again. After everything with Derek, Claire had learned to think first and trust second. Every new person now made her more careful, not less. On the 4th day, coming home after her shift, she took the card out again. She looked at the number for a few seconds, then dialed. "Hi, this is Claire, from the diner." "I remember you." Ethan's voice carried a faint smile. "I thought you might not call." "I thought about your offer, the side work." "Great. I actually need someone who can look over a few documents remotely. Nothing complicated, just a fresh set of eyes." The next day, he sent her scans of several reports over text. No lengthy explanation, just asked her to check them for errors. Claire pulled out the old notebook she'd kept since prison and settled in at Frank's kitchen table that evening. The desk lamp lit up the pages, it was getting dark outside, and a cup of tea cooled beside her. She worked through the numbers one by one, carefully checking the math. Gradually, Claire caught herself wearing that same focused expression she used to have back in her own office. The numbers fell into place, errors turned up one after another, and for a few hours, nothing else in the world mattered. She found 2 small inaccuracies, nothing critical, but telling. Rounding errors in the calculations that, compounded over time, created a noticeable discrepancy in the quarterly figures. Claire sent Ethan a detailed write-up of what she'd found late that night, not expecting a quick reply. He answered 10 minutes later. "You're right on both counts. Thank you. Could I send a few more documents this week?" Claire read the message over and smiled. It had been a long time since she'd felt this sure of what she was doing. She'd been given work with no pity in it, no favor being done. Someone had simply seen what she could do and asked for more of it. She set the phone down and looked back at her notes. A skill she'd assumed belonged to her old life, it turned out, still mattered now. After 2 weeks of steady remote work, Ethan suggested they meet in person to discuss a bigger project. They met not at the crossroads, but at a small office on the outskirts of Worcester, the same building where part of his logistics business was based. Claire wore the nicest clothes she still owned, a plain dark sweater and slacks, bought with her first paycheck from the diner. Ethan met her at the entrance and led her to a conference room, where a folder of documents thicker than the previous ones already sat on the table.
"The problem's bigger than it first looked," he said, sitting across from her. "That expense shift you found, that's just the surface. My finance people think there's some kind of systemic leak somewhere, but they haven't been able to find the source in 2 months of looking." "Let me see the documents," Claire said, reaching for the folder. But before she could open it, Ethan spoke, looking straight at her. "Before we go on, I looked into you. I'm sorry for not asking first, but this project is serious, and I need to know who I'm working with." Claire felt her fingers go cold. She stayed quiet, waiting for the rest. "I know about the conviction," he said evenly, no judgment in his voice. "And the sentence. The record's sealed, but I have connections who could fill in the details." She straightened and met his eyes. After that, she was bracing for him to end things right there. "Then you probably understand why I should just leave now," she said quietly. "No," Ethan said. "What I understand is something else. The conviction was for financial fraud, but someone who can find a systemic error in a holding company's consolidated reports in an hour is either a brilliant con artist or the victim of someone else's scheme. Judging by how you work, the second one is a lot more likely." Claire didn't know what to say. I don't care what it says in your file, he went on. I care about what you're doing now. If you want to tell me your story, tell me. If not, we just keep working. She told him. Not all at once. The conversation stretched across several meetings. Sometimes they'd be going over documents, and Ethan would ask a question, and Claire would remember one more detail. That was how, bit by bit, he learned about Derek, the shell companies, the trial, giving birth under guard, and the daughter she was now trying to get back. He listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a clarifying question. It was clear the details mattered to him. He understood, better than most, exactly how a financial scheme could be built so that the paperwork ended up pointing at an entirely different person. "Do you still have documents from that case?" he asked once, after she'd finished telling him about the trial. "Some of them, copies my lawyer gave me." "Can I see them?" Claire wasn't sure at first why he'd want to, but she brought a folder of yellowed copies to their next meeting, the little that remained from 4 years of fighting to prove her innocence. Ethan went through the documents for a long time. He kept returning to the same page, jotting notes, running numbers on a calculator. Finally, he set down his pen. "You know, the scheme they used to set you up looks a lot like what I'm seeing in my own numbers right now." Claire looked up. "What do you mean?" "Shell companies, nominee directors, shifted liabilities, someone else's digital signature used without their knowledge." He tapped a finger on one of the pages. "You already had this happen to you, right here." Claire looked at the document. "You think it's connected?" "I don't know yet, but there are too many similarities to ignore." A chill ran down her spine. If Ethan was right, this could be much bigger than she'd thought. Maybe Derek hadn't worked alone. The thought made her look at the old documents again, differently this time. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, "Would you want an official position at my company?" Claire didn't understand at first. "What do you mean?" "Not side work, a real job. You'd handle financial oversight and project audits." She looked down. "I have a record." "I know. That could cause problems for you." "We'll deal with it." Claire looked at him. "Why do you trust me?" Ethan thought about it for a moment. "Because I've seen how you work. That's enough for me." The job at Ethan's company started with a small office on the second floor. Modest, but hers, with a new computer and a stack of documents waiting for her attention. The first few weeks, she kept her guard up, careful not to step outside a strictly professional relationship, even though she could feel Ethan treated her differently than the rest of his staff. More attentive, warmer, but without ever pushing. One evening, staying late to go over another report, he noticed the ring on her finger. "Sorry, Claire, what about your husband?" She froze for a second, then looked down at the ring. "I don't have a husband." Ethan frowned slightly. "Then I'm confused." Claire allowed herself a small smile. "The ring keeps certain men at a distance." Ethan looked at her more closely, then smirked. "Does it work?" "Sometimes," she said, letting herself smile too, just barely. Ethan nodded and went back to the documents. Nothing about his behavior changed after that conversation. He didn't start inviting her for coffee more often, didn't keep her late without reason, didn't drift into personal topics. Claire appreciated that. After Derek, she knew all too well how someone else's persistence could end. A month into the job, Claire came across a pattern that kept her at the office late into the night. She'd been reviewing contracts with one of the construction material suppliers, a routine task as part of a broader review Ethan had asked for after a few minor findings. At first, nothing looked unusual, but then one company led to another. Several contractors had been registered almost simultaneously. They shared a registered address at an unremarkable office building. The listed directors were nominees, and part of the payments were disguised as fees for services that, according to the paperwork,
didn't actually exist. Claire started pulling everything together into one table. The total turned out to be far bigger than she'd first assumed.
This wasn't a handful of suspicious payments anymore. It was tens of millions of dollars moving, month after month, through a network of shell contracts. She printed out a diagram of the connections between the companies and spread the pages across her desk. Then she sat looking at them for a long time. She'd once laid out documents from her own case the exact same way, trying to figure out exactly where she'd been set up. Claire pulled the old folder of copies from her own case out of a drawer and set it beside the new diagram. She started comparing them. Registered addresses, nominee directors, transfers between related companies, the wording in the contracts. One pattern, then another, then a third. Claire sat back in her chair. She'd seen this before, 4 years ago. Except back then, all these documents had been pointed against her. Now she was looking at them from the outside, and for the first time she could compare the two schemes with a clear head.
She pulled the pages back toward her again. "It can't be," she said quietly. But the longer she studied the documents, the less room there was for doubt. Someone was using the same playbook, possibly the same people. She didn't close the folder until well past midnight. In the morning, she laid both diagrams on Ethan's desk without a word. He studied them for a long time, glancing between the two, then looked up at Claire. "Are you sure?" "It's the same handwriting," she said. "Companies registered in batches, the same nominee directors moving from one firm to the next, payments disguised as consulting or logistics fees. My case looked exactly like this. I never got to follow the whole chain. I was arrested before I could finish tracing it." Ethan stood without a word, walked to the window, then turned back around. "So whoever built this scheme inside my company is either using the same method as whoever set you up, or it's the same person." "There's a way to check," Claire said. "We'd need to pull the registration records for every company in both schemes. If we find shared founders, shared registered addresses, or a shared accountant, that's not a coincidence anymore." "I'll bring in the lawyers," Ethan said. "I've got a good team. They can pull the registration data and trace the connections between the companies." The lawyers worked for almost 3 weeks straight, digging through archives, requesting filings from the state's corporate registry, cross-referencing dates, names, and addresses. Claire helped, not in name only, but for real, digging up the smallest details from her own old case. Company names that had come up briefly during the trial, names mentioned in passing during conversations with Derek, even what the office in that out-of-the-way building had looked like, the one she'd once been brought to for a meeting with partners.
One evening, one of the lawyers, a young man named Josh Reynolds, walked into Ethan's office with a printout in hand, clearly wound up. "We found her," he said, laying the pages on the desk. "Rebecca Stiles, listed as a co-owner of one of the companies in the current scheme, Meridian Build Consulting. Officially holds a 25% stake, registered as a member of the company 3 years ago." Claire felt something go cold inside her. "That's her," she said quietly. "Derek's bookkeeper. The woman whose voice I heard back then at the restaurant when he was on the phone." "And that's not all," Josh went on, pulling out the next printout. "Other documents show a connection to a man named Derek Pierce, the same one from your case. He's not listed directly on any of the companies, but 2 of the registered addresses match addresses used in your scheme 4 years ago." Ethan looked at Claire. "He didn't disappear," he said slowly. "He just moved up a level."
Further digging revealed the scope of it. Over the past 6 years, at least 3 other businesswomen had been hit by something similar. All of them successful, roughly the same age, without much family to fall back on. In 2 cases, it never went to trial. The women had caught what was happening in time, managed to preserve their records, and avoided charges. In the third, the victim had gotten a suspended sentence, lost her business, and left the state. Late one night, Claire sat in the conference room going through the collected files. Printouts covered the table, coffee cooling beside them. It had been dark outside for hours. "He picks his victims by the same formula every time," she said. "Alone, successful, emotionally open. No one who could step in fast and protect them." "A cold calculation," Ethan noted, flipping through the documents. "He doesn't fall for these women. He picks them out like assets." Claire didn't answer. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the page. Derek rose up in front of her again. His calm voice, his confident gestures, the way he'd talked about business. Back then, she'd believed every word. "Where is he now?" she finally asked. Josh, who'd been checking the latest printout, looked up. "Circumstantial evidence puts him out of the country. There's a trail leading to Spain. Same place as Rebecca Stiles' last known address. Based on the social media of one of his more recent acquaintances, he's over there now, presenting himself as an investor, moving in circles connected to real estate and private investment." Alongside the investigation, life went on as usual. Claire kept working, kept saving, kept preparing her documents for DCF. In early December, the letter she'd been waiting months for arrived, with a photograph. A small snapshot, clearly taken at some kind of morning event at the group home. A girl of about 4, serious-faced, with dark curly hair, in a plain blue dress, standing among other children and looking straight into the camera with an expression Claire couldn't quite place. Curiosity, maybe, or wariness. She held the photo so long she lost track of everything around her. Studying the features, looking for something of herself in them, something of herself or of the man whose face she'd long tried not to remember. A short note from a staff member was attached to the letter. "Chloe is a calm child, likes to draw, and is attached to a stuffed rabbit she's had since she first came to the facility." A stuffed rabbit.
Claire remembered. It was one of the few things she'd managed to send through Frank in the first months after giving birth. A small gift that, it turned out, her daughter had carried through all these years, through 2 group homes, through changes in caregivers and groups. Claire closed her eyes, pressed the photo to her chest, and cried. The tears came on their own, and she didn't try to stop them. Her daughter was alive, healthy. She liked to draw. She had the stuffed rabbit Claire had once sent her. But right behind the relief came a new wave of worry. The same letter noted, flatly, that the time the child could remain in the system without restored parental rights was approaching its limit, after which the agency would begin proceedings to terminate parental rights and find an adoptive family for permanent placement.
According to the caseworker, there wasn't much time left. DCF was already considering moving toward permanent placement, and any further delay could trigger termination proceedings. Claire brought the news to Ethan after work. She'd carried the letter in her hands the whole way over and only worked up the nerve to show him once she reached his office door. He read it carefully, then looked up at her. 3 months isn't much, but it's enough if we move fast, he said. What do you still need for the full document package? I've got steady work now, Claire said. Housing. Technically, I'm living at Frank's and using his address, but DCF might treat that as temporary. And the big one, the record. Without the conviction overturned, or at least some official recognition of new circumstances, my odds of a favorable ruling stay low. Ethan was quiet for a few seconds. Then we speed up the investigation. He got up from his desk. If we can gather enough evidence connecting the old scheme to the current one, the lawyers will have grounds to file for a review of your case based on new evidence. The next 2 weeks, the lawyers worked almost without stopping. Pulling registration records, cross-checking bank statements, matching up dates and names. They found one of the nominee directors who agreed to testify in exchange for reduced liability. Bit by bit, the scattered documents started forming into a single chain. By the end of the 2nd week, they'd gathered enough for the lawyers to file an official motion to vacate with the Suffolk County Court, sending a copy to the district attorney's office. The motion was accepted for review in mid-January. No one promised a quick ruling, but now Claire could submit additional documentation to DCF. Her conviction was officially being challenged in court on the basis of new evidence. At the same time, the lawyers turned up another important piece of information. Derek Pierce was planning to attend a private investor's reception in Marbella at the end of January, the kind of event that drew people investing in coastal real estate. According to one source, Derek was already in talks with a wealthy widow and appeared to be preparing to run his old scheme again, this time on a different woman. If we can get evidence right there, witnesses, documents he might be carrying, it'll seriously strengthen the case, Josh said at their next meeting. Spanish police have already been given a heads up by our partners. They're ready to step in if there's sufficient cause. Ethan looked at Claire. Will you come with me? Dear listeners, let's take one more quick pause. If this story has resonated with you or reminded you of something close to your own life, please support it with a like. To me, that's the best sign that these lives and struggles are actually landing with you. And share in the comments. What city, what corner of the world are you listening from right now? It always warms my heart to see how one simple, honest story can bring people together from all over. Thank you for your support and your honesty. Now, let's keep going. She was quiet for a long moment, feeling two things fight for control inside her. The fear of seeing, again, the man who'd destroyed her life, and a cold, hard-won resolve to see this through to the end. I'll come, she said finally. I want to look him in the eye. Not for revenge, just so he understands. I'm still here. Frank, hearing the plan, just shook his head and muttering something under his breath about people picking the calmest possible times for this kind of thing, went and dug an old, battered suitcase out of the closet anyway. At least take a decent suitcase, he said. Can't go handle serious business with a backpack.
The plane landed in Malaga late in the evening, the sky over the coast still holding that southern warmth, despite it being the end of January. It had been years since Claire had flown anywhere farther than the next state over, and a strange sense of unreality had followed her since takeoff, like she was watching her own life from somewhere outside it. Ethan had rented a small villa on the outskirts of Marbella. It was close to where the reception would be held, and a hotel would have made it harder to prepare quietly without drawing attention. Before they left, Frank had packed Claire a small envelope of documents and photographs, just in case, he'd said, without saying in case of what exactly. The investor's reception was set for 2 days later, at an estate on the coast, where Ethan had been invited as a potential partner for one of the local funds, a connection his lawyers had arranged ahead of time to give him a legitimate reason to be in the same room where Derek was expected to show up. The night before the event, Claire stood a long time on the villa's balcony, looking out at the dark water, thinking about how in a few hours she'd come face to face with the man who'd cost her 9 years of her life. 9 years of hard work that had turned into 4 years behind bars. Ethan came out after her, stood beside her without touching her, just there. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Calm." Claire was surprised by her own answer. Not long ago, she'd pictured this meeting going very differently. She'd imagined her throat closing up at the sight of Derek, her hands shaking, that same helplessness from the first days after her arrest coming rushing back.
But none of that was happening. I used to think I'd be hit with panic or rage when I saw him again, she said. Right now, all I feel is one thing. I want this to be over. Over the right way. The estate where the reception was held was staggering in scale. Marble floors, high ceilings, live music out on a terrace overlooking the sea. The guests, mostly investors and property owners from various countries, wandered around with champagne flutes, discussing projects and deals in the low voices such events call for. Claire spotted Derek almost right away, standing by a floor-to-ceiling window in an impeccable suit, next to a woman of about 45 in an expensive dress, listening to him with an expression of complete trust on her face. He looked exactly the same as he had that evening at the country club years ago, confident, charming, seemingly untouched by the years or by the crimes he'd committed. She walked over calmly, without hurrying, aware of Ethan staying a couple of steps behind her, not interfering, but making it clear he was there. "Hello, Derek," she said, stopping in front of him. He turned toward the voice, and Claire watched, for a fraction of a second, his face freeze. The familiar mask of friendliness cracking just enough to show what was underneath. Recognition, mixed with a flicker of panic, he immediately tried to bury under a polite half-smile. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" he said, but his voice gave away a hesitation too long for a man used to always having the right words ready. "We know each other well enough," Claire said evenly, "though you might prefer to forget." The woman beside him looked back and forth between them, clearly lost. "You must have the wrong person," she tried to step in. "Derek's an old friend of mine. We're looking at a coastal property together." "I don't doubt that you are," Claire said, turning to her with a gentleness that surprised even herself. "Sorry, how long have you two known each other?" "About 6 months," the woman answered, thrown slightly off balance by the bluntness of the question. 6 months is just about the amount of time," Claire said quietly. "It usually takes him to tell you everything about his business and show you nothing on paper." Derek tried to take her by the elbow, steer her aside, lowering his voice. "Claire, listen, this isn't the place for—" "Don't touch me," she said, calm but firm, pulling her arm away. "We're old acquaintances, Derek, just talking." Derek's mouth tightened for a second, but the calm smile returned almost as fast. "Of course," he said, turning back to the woman. "I'm sorry. She really is someone from my past." He paused briefly, as if choosing his words carefully. "We haven't seen each other in a long time. I think Claire's a little emotional right now." The woman looked at him with a question in her eyes. "You two were involved?" "We had a relationship a long time ago. Unfortunately, after we split up, she went through a rough patch, and as far as I understand, she still blames me for everything that happened to her." He said it calmly, almost with regret, and a few people nearby had already started glancing their way. Claire watched him and could almost physically feel him doing what he'd always done best, rearranging who played which role, in the space of a few seconds. Derek gave the woman a small smile. "I really don't want to make a scene at an event like this. Let's pick this up later." But the woman was already looking at Claire differently. Something guarded had crept into her expression. "Claire, were you really involved with him?" "I was." The woman looked at Claire, then at Derek. "And everything you just said is true." Claire held her gaze, calm. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Just check the paperwork."
Something shifted, barely, in Derek's face. "Claire, don't ask him for the documents on the companies he owns," she went on without raising her voice. "Real documents, registration records, ownership, accounts, not a slideshow on his laptop." The woman was looking at Derek very differently now. He stood perfectly still, only his fingers tightened just slightly around the stem of his glass. Claire didn't make a scene. She didn't shout, didn't accuse him loudly in front of the guests, even though everything in her was still trembling with tension. She just stood there another moment, looking him in the eye with a calm that seemed to hit him harder than any shouting could have. She turned and walked back to Ethan, leaving Derek standing there, his face frozen, his confidence gone. Once they were outside the estate, Claire walked in silence for a few minutes. Ethan didn't ask any questions. He just walked beside her, giving her time to collect herself. At the waterfront, Claire stopped and looked out at the water. "I need to walk for a bit." "Of course." They walked along the shore. The evening air was cool, carrying the damp smell of the sea. Lights flickered in the distance, the pavement tapping quietly underfoot. They walked in silence for a few minutes. "I thought it would be worse," Claire said finally. "All these years, I imagined seeing him again, what I'd say to him, what I'd feel." Ethan looked at her. "And it turned out different?" Claire nodded. "Yes. I looked at him and realized, all at once, that I wasn't afraid of him anymore." She took a few more steps, then stopped. "I just don't understand why it's still hard right now." Ethan didn't answer. Claire lowered her eyes. 4 years I imagined this moment. I thought someday I'd stand in front of him and say everything. And today I said 2 sentences, and it was over. Not everything, Ethan said quietly. But you already did the part that matters most.
Claire looked at him. Which part is that? You got your life back. She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she smiled, suddenly, tired, barely there. Can I just stay close to you a minute? Of course. Claire stepped toward him and hugged him first. Ethan carefully hugged her back. At first, she held herself stiffly, as if still unused to the idea that she could just lean into another person like this. Then her shoulders relaxed and she closed her eyes. For 4 years, she'd gotten used to handling everything on her own, answering the investigators' questions alone, holding herself together in court alone, working alone, searching for her daughter alone. And right now, she didn't have to explain a single thing. They just stood there in the middle of the evening waterfront while people passed by and the waves lapped quietly somewhere near the water. After a while, Claire said quietly, "Thank you." For what? For being here. Ethan pulled her a little closer. "I'm not going anywhere." Claire lifted her head and looked at him. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. Then she leaned in first and kissed him, briefly. She pulled back almost immediately, as if surprised at herself for doing it. Ethan smiled. "Did I read that right?" Claire laughed, for the first time all evening. "Don't go ruining it now." He smiled too and pulled her back into a hug. They stood by the water a little longer, then slowly started back. What came next didn't happen fast, and it wasn't dramatic the way it might be in a movie. The legal machinery just ground forward, piece by piece. The materials they'd gathered had already been passed to the Spanish partners of Ethan's legal team, and the next day, Spanish police, who'd already opened their own inquiry based on that information, independently reviewed the documents of several guests at the reception, Derek among them. Discrepancies turned up in the registration records for the companies he claimed to own, and that was enough grounds to detain him on the spot. Quietly, without any public fuss, but for good. Rebecca Stiles was picked up a few days later in another city. She'd been trying to move the last of the assets through a fresh chain of shell companies, but an international request filed on the basis of the Massachusetts criminal case beat her to it. The review of Claire's case came through 2 months later. After the gathered evidence, the testimony of the nominee director who'd agreed to cooperate, and the records from the Spanish arrest all came together to form the basis of a new investigation. The court found that the sentence handed down 4 years earlier had rested on fabricated evidence. Forensic analysis established that some of the signatures on the key documents had been forged using real samples of Claire's signature. Derek had gotten hold of them ahead of time, under the pretext of paperwork for their shared apartment. Claire sat in the courtroom, same city, different building, and listened to the ruling. She'd waited 4 years for these words. When the judge announced that the conviction against Claire Donahue was being vacated on the basis of newly discovered evidence, she simply looked down at her hands. No tears. None of the joy she'd once imagined she'd feel. Just quiet. As if something that should have been given back to her 4 years ago had finally been returned. Some of her assets were located and recovered, but of everything she'd lost over those years, little was left to reclaim. No one could give her back 4 years of her life. And still, her record now carried a new line. Conviction vacated, case closed on the basis of newly discovered evidence. Claire read it over several times. She was free of the charge now. Once the conviction was vacated, Claire's lawyers filed the necessary paperwork with the court and DCF to reopen reunification proceedings. The court approved returning the child to her mother after reviewing her living situation, and DCF completed the remaining formalities. With that document in hand, she drove to the group home in Lowell with Ethan. The drive took a little over an hour, and Claire barely spoke the whole way, watching out the window, gripping the folder of documents in her hands. The same folder she'd been assembling for so long she could no longer remember the moment she'd started. The facility's director, a middle-aged woman with a tired but kind face, met them in her office, looked carefully through all the paperwork, and finally nodded. "Everything's in order.
The documents meet the requirements. I'll take you to her. I do want to warn you. Chloe won't remember you, of course. She was too young. Give her time. They walked down a hallway painted a pale yellow, past rooms full of children's laughter and the voices of caregivers, and stopped at the door to the playroom. The girl was sitting on the floor, drawing something on a big sheet of paper, a worn, stuffed rabbit with one ear torn off lying beside her. She looked up when the director came in and looked at Claire with the ordinary curiosity of a child, no recognition in her eyes. Claire crouched down, feeling her knees shake, not from weakness, but from a nervousness she couldn't get a handle on, despite all the years she'd spent preparing for this exact moment. "Hi," she said quietly. Chloe looked at her carefully, tilting her head, studying the stranger with that open directness only small children have. "Are you my mom?" she asked suddenly, no preamble, plain and direct, the way children ask things.
Claire felt her breath catch. She'd imagined this moment so many times, rehearsed the words she'd say so many times in her head. But now every prepared sentence had vanished, and she just crouched there, looking at her daughter, unable to answer right away. "Yes," she said finally, her voice breaking despite everything she did to hold it together. "Yes, I'm your mom." Chloe studied her for another few seconds, then held out the stuffed rabbit. "This is Winston. His ear fell off, but my teacher promised to sew it back on." "We'll definitely get it sewn," Claire said, taking the toy as carefully as if she were holding something impossibly precious. Ethan, standing a little way off, turned to look out the window, giving them their first minutes alone, though it was clear from his face that he was struggling to hold back his own emotions. Chloe looked at Claire. "Are you going to live with me now?" Claire closed her eyes for a second, then looked at her daughter.
"If you want me to, I will." Chloe thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "I want you to." 6 months passed. The home Claire now shared with Chloe and Ethan, not Frank's old house, but an apartment in town, close enough to Sterling that they could still visit often, filled up every morning with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary life. The kettle rattling, the fridge door creaking open, a child's voice humming something to herself while she gathered her toys before daycare. Claire made breakfast, listening to Chloe explain to Winston, his ear sewn back on now, why they couldn't be late for group today. Eggs sizzled on the stove. A warm summer rain pattered against the window. The phone rang. Frank, like he did most mornings, calling to complain about something around the house. "Listen to this," he said, skipping any greeting. "Those guys repainted my kitchen floor the wrong color. I told them, lighter. I wanted it lighter, and they go and put down dark brown." "Frank, you like dark colors. You said so yourself," Claire said, smiling, holding the phone between her shoulder and ear while she flipped the eggs. "Yeah, well, I do like it," he grumbled after a pause. "Just gotten used to complaining about something. Can't seem to quit." She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a long while, easily, without any tightness underneath it. Ethan walked into the kitchen, already dressed, looking annoyed, patting down his pockets. "You seen my keys?" he asked. "On the table by the door, where they always are," Claire said, not turning around. He went out, came back a minute later with the keys, kissed her temple on his way past, and sat down at the table next to Chloe, who immediately launched into an update on Winston and the fact that they'd be painting with paints at daycare today. Claire set the plate of eggs down on the table, looked at the two of them, her daughter gesturing animatedly with her spoon, Ethan nodding along seriously to a 4-year-old's reasoning, and felt the thing she'd been searching for all these years, the thing she'd never quite been able to put into words. An ordinary life. Simple, unremarkable to anyone looking in from outside, exactly what had once been taken from her. There was a different ring on her finger now, not the worn one she'd carried for protection all those years, but a simple one, no flourishes, that Ethan had slid onto her hand one evening without any fanfare, just saying, "I want this to be real." She'd taken the old ring off that same night and never put it on again. Mom, are we giving Winston some eggs too? Chloe asked. Claire laughed. Ethan looked at the stuffed rabbit with complete seriousness. Of course. He got up early today too. Chloe nodded, satisfied, and dragged Winston over to the table. Claire looked at the two of them and smiled. And that's the story. Not an easy one, but a hopeful one, about how even when everything is taken from a person, a home, a good name, years of freedom, no one can take away a mother's love, or her faith that things can still be set right. Sometimes the people who aren't your family become closer than family ever was. And something as small as a plain ring, or the warmth of an old wood stove, can help you get through the hardest winter of your life. So tell me, friends, do you think it's really possible to forgive someone who tore your life apart? Or should justice always come first? And have you ever met someone as generous and good-hearted as Frank in your own life? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this story touched you, show it some love with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Take care of yourselves, cherish the people close to you, and may your home always be full of peace, warmth, and comfort. See you next time.